Cool beans.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Trey.
Welcome. Thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you, and thank you for my lovely coffee.
Oh, you're welcome. So we've known each other for years, and you are the founder and principal of Minority Health Consultants.
I am.
And a former CHW student, and that's where we met.
Yes, of yours.
Yes, a community health worker. And you were such a rock star in public health education that you were a natural to inherit instructing the class. And so you've been working on community health work for a long time. Why is expanding the community health worker profession so important in Las Vegas and in this community?
Well, one of the reasons why I advocate so hard for community health workers is because I saw why we were needed during the pandemic, specifically in my community, but how that transits all the way out to the other communities and to obviously your city, to your state, then to the world, right? During the pandemic, it was really hard to get PPE and information and just education out to the Black community. There was nobody to do that work. All of us public health professionals were sitting inside waiting for someone to tell us to go. And it was, is it the state that's going to tell us to go? Is it the health district? Who's in charge right now? So just in that instance of trying to figure things out, this went on for months. In the meantime, people are dying. Community health workers could have been utilized during that time because that's what they're trained for. You and I train them to go out into the communities for pandemics, for endemics, for just regular everyday education. And so if we trained, I know I've trained personally over now with the Nevada CHW Association, probably over 200 people, and then at CSN, 100 people. So that's 300 on my end, probably 400 on your end, and then all the other instructors. We have thousands of CHWs out there, and nobody was on the ground. Nobody was on the ground in the Hispanic community. Nobody was on the ground in the Black communities. And I don't know about the other communities, but I'm guessing they weren't there either. And so while we're waiting for someone to make a leadership decision, community health workers could have been advocating, give us PPEs, we'll go do it. Because sometimes that's what you have to do. Sometimes you have to take things from the government and say, I'll go do it myself. I'll go save my community. And that's what a community health worker does and should be doing. So I advocate really hard for them because they have the skill sets. They are the trusted messengers from their community. They understand the language that's spoken in that community, whether it's a non-language, but it's a known language amongst the community, or whether that's a preferred language. If I speak Spanish, but I'm Spanish from Ecuador versus I'm Spanish from Mexico, someone will know that and they'll get the right person in there. But they also will have a trusted relationship amongst themselves because they all speak Spanish, right? I can't walk into a Spanish community and get that same trust. Neither can you. So why not hire community health workers, train them to go out into the communities and do pretty much what they're already doing anyways, which is helping one another. And we know that a lot of minority and BIPOC communities really stick together, and they are the trusted people amongst their groups. And so if they're already kind of doing that without pay, why not train them so that they can be efficient at it 4 times of a pandemic?
It sounds like a lot of that, like as far as outreach to particular communities, is a function of cultural competence.
Absolutely. So
how could the state government be more culturally competent?
Ask questions. Get into the community. Don't sit behind a desk and assume that you know the community. I've had somebody tell me, I won't name the hospital, but they basically told me in an email that they know more about my community than me because they went to college and they have a bachelor's in public health. And I went to college, but I'm also Black. So that's something above what you have. And I was just kind of taken aback. And I stopped, you know how they tell you to stop, don't send that email because my fingers got to typing a response, but I had to pause and say, this person's ignorant. And how do we respond to ignorance? We don't respond with more ignorance. So I had to, walk away, go get something to eat, come back and just say, now, how do you handle ignorant people? You train them, you educate them. So I went to work on providing education on book knowledge versus cultural competence knowledge, and why cultural competence, why I have more of that than they would for my community. I thought it was very braggadocious of them to think that you can sit and read about a culture, We see from TV and from media that we don't know shit about other communities. It's the perception that we do because media gives us that perception. For instance, I have a massage therapist who's from Africa. We speak about this kind of stuff all the time because we're two Black women. We have some things in common. She may be from another country, but we have racism in common. We have experiences in common. She told me that when she tells people that she's from Africa, her clients that come in, they always ask her, how did you get here? Did you have air conditioning in your house? Did you guys live in huts? And I literally like stopped the massage and like turned around and looked at her and was like, are you joking with me right now? And she's like, no, I literally get these questions to this day in 2022. And I just said, that's media. Media has trained us to think that we know people and we really don't know shit about people. And until you get into that community, until you get with friends, learn people, you're never going to really know another culture. We only think that we do by media, by things that we see and things that we hearsay and stereotypes, right? So I'm really big on, and that's for me as well. I love having diverse friends. Look, I'm sitting here with you. And I love going and hearing about different, like meeting someone's grandmother, right? The grandmother alone will teach you a lot about that culture. You come in, sometimes you take off your shoes, and they'll tell you, oh, honey, take off those shoes. We don't allow evil spirits in here, things of that nature. And you're like, huh? And you get to ask questions because now they've invited you into their home. You don't get to ask questions to people unless you really get close enough to them.
It's so inspiring because in addition to being culturally competent, the first thing to recognize as being culturally humble.
Yes, humility. So that's one of the big things that I do in my classes now, that I'm not with the other program that we were with. I get to kind of massage what I think is important. And we're trying to kind of push out competence and speak more about humility and sensitivity. Because we'll never truly be competent in any other race or ethnic group that's not our own. So even just in public health in general, that I hear that that's a big thing that's happening is that, oh, don't say competence, say, humility and sensitivity. But I'm also teaching my community health workers to think you'll never be able to go into another culture's or race's neighborhood and think that you know more about them than they do. If anything, you need to be humble walking into that neighborhood, asking questions. That's when people give you the respect because they see that you're respecting them. So to come in all, haughty and think that you are the experts in them, I think is foolish. And I think it harms us more than causes us to come together.
So in the communities you work with primarily, would you say that they are most responsive to, do they see cultural humility as a strength or do they see it as a weakness? No,
they definitely see it as a strength. Because if I, for instance, am doing community health work, because I do, I'm not above that, and I'm going to a neighborhood or a event, a health planning event that's not of my culture, my race, I walk in very humbly, and I make sure that I don't walk in as the 10-year public health expert because they can see that on you. It's like, you sense some things on people. The arrogance, right? Oh, the arrogance of this person walking in, thinking that they're going to come here and save us. And BIPOC and minority communities already have that just awareness of kind of how other people see them. And so because you know that, because hopefully you're culturally competent, you want to walk in with your guard down so that they can put their guard down. That's how you truly help someone. If I have my guard up, you're not really going to get to me. I'm not really going to listen to what you're saying. I may shake my head, but it just went in one ear and out the other. It's interesting because when we talk about prescriptive stuff like we know what's best for you, it seems like that's what the parties are doing. Yes. So do you have any experience with which party best represents the interests that you're working with or your community needs? So I would just like to make a disclosure. I'm not a political expert or anything of that nature. Actually, I'm really starting now in my 40s, if you can believe it or not, really starting to get interested in it. In my 30s, obviously with Obama coming in, that's when a lot of Black people were like, I need to know what's going on. Like, what is happening? We have someone that looks like us now. Of course, I had to take history class in college and political science and all of those things. You have those classes, so you have a little bit of interest or knowledge. But I didn't go to college for political science, so obviously it wasn't like a huge thing of mine. But I do understand laws. I do understand bills. I do understand the people that you put in are the ones who push for those things, or they advocate against those. And so I would say African Americans typically try to sway with Democratic Party because that's what our parents and our grandparents taught us. But the history on that is very interesting because I like to know why. I'm the why kid. My mom will tell you, but why? Don't just tell me to do something. One, I'm a Taurus.
We have that in common.
Two, don't just tell me something and not expect me to go and look it up. So if people do the research on the Democratic Party, actually African Americans used to vote Republican. Martin Luther King was actually Republican first.
Interesting.
They used the party to basically try to trick people into voting for Republican or voting for Democratic by switching like ballots and things of that nature. Like there's a whole thing around it. And we just kind of stayed that way. So once we voted Democratic, because that's what was on the ballot, and we saw the names that we recognized, we stayed Democrats. So it's interesting to me that a lot of people don't do their research. They just literally listen to who's ever in that party. And to me, that's dangerous because we're not flocks, we're not sheeps, but we're acting like it. And so we see what's happening with people who act like they don't have brains of their own, is that the government's going to take advantage of that. And they're going to lead you to where they want you to be versus you making the decision for yourself.
It's interesting because the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, was Republicans. And Democrats were very against it.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. That's when that switch was happening. The history on that is just...
I mean, it really kind of coincides with Reconstruction.
Yes.
When the Union was reformed, they flipped to Democrats because they were so mad at the...
Exactly.
And that's interesting because when we look at, I don't know if how long you've been in Las Vegas or
My
Nevada.
whole life.
So we're the Mississippi of the West. You've heard
Yes.
that before.
Yep.
All forever,
My
right?
family is literally from Mississippi.
Yep.
They're literally from Mississippi. My mom is from Mississippi. My stepfather is from Mississippi. They had to flee. My stepfather, now he has an interesting story. Basically, he told a white woman that she was beautiful or something like that down in Mississippi, and his family had to flee. Literally, the KKK were coming for his family. He has a whole street now. They do a parade and march because they killed him. They hung him.
Wow.
There's a whole history of that, and it's interesting to see that they started in Mississippi, but now they fled to California. But when you talk to a lot of people that are in there, I would say 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they still know their history. Most of them are from the South. Most of them are from Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, and this was supposed to be a safe place to go, but not knowing that even coming to Las Vegas, there's a history here of Sammy Davis Jr. Having to go into the hotels behind the hotel. He couldn't walk through the front door, and it's just so much, right?
And he was headlining there. I mean,
yes.
It's crazy.
Sammy Davis Jr.
Yeah.
We all love him. Whites love him. Blacks love him. But yet he was being walked in behind the hotel where the rats are. So it just kind of shows you that the mindset was to flee, get to where we can be, right? Get to where we can prosper. And I think that has also had a lot to do with our political views, right? I think we felt like Democrats or just the party itself was a safe place, and we're going to stay in that safe place because they have our best interest. And so I actually have a question for you. We've known each other for years. We've always had very open conversations about kind of everything. When you decided to run for as a nonpartisan, I was like, well, that's interesting. I want to know why. So can you tell me why you decided to do that?
Oh, yeah. So I lost my right to vote when I was convicted of theft. And that's a function of a state. The detail is that your right to vote is because of your state citizenship. Right. So with what happened to me, basically my right to vote was gone. And then I had to do probation. And then there was in the statute, there was a time frame where I could do things and ask for my rights to be restored, but I had to be proactive and do it. And I've always valued that right ever since I learned about it. So,
right.
I'm in recovery from gambling addiction. I can guarantee you I was never consciously betting my right to vote. It never occurred to me. So that kind of burned when I didn't have a voice anymore. Yeah. And it was the most basic voice ever. But then in 2017, a group of legislators, including Jason Frierson, Aaron Ford, William McCurdy, and Steve Yeager, did a comprehensive criminal justice reform and civil rights restoration. Wow. And it's super simple. And Aaron Ford, then Senator, now Attorney General, was like, unless you're in prison, you can vote in Nevada.
Wow.
And so that's when I got my right to vote back. That was exciting. I was a little nervous, actually. But I sat down, so I hadn't been able to vote for 10 years, and at that point, 11 years. And I was previously a Democrat. And I had worked at the legislature. I'd worked with different elected officials, and they were not what I remember. When I was active in party politics in the 90s, late 90s, Bill Clinton, New Democrat, it was socially liberal, fiscally conservative. But after a couple sessions, I found allies on both sides. And it was really because of the practicality of what recovery required. It wasn't treatment and pills and things like that. I needed a job and housing. And the brand of the felony stopped that. It was extremely difficult to get a job. And thankfully, I was educated and I didn't have to try to get credit or a job application or a loan for school or something, because no go.
You wouldn't have been able to get one. Wow.
So I really struggled with that because and honestly, in my recovery, I had a lot of friends, and the Democrats wouldn't talk to me. There was so much stigma around what I had done. Wow. And there was at that time, and I think it's changed a little bit, I hope it's changed, the crime was the stigma, and everything, there was no capacity to distinguish the reason for the crime, So I haven't continued theft because I'm not gambling.
Right.
And so that's the connection. And when I registered, this is a personal thing, right? And I sat there and I went, I just cannot. I got a lot of help from Republicans, but I can't.
Right.
And Democrats, I can't either. And that's when I personally chose nonpartisan. But I did more research, and that's where Nevada is really interesting, because at this point in time, nonpartisans are more than Democrats or Republicans. And that's why I described that it's a winnable, the nonpartisan vote can swing any district in
Do you
this
think
state.
a lot of people know that fact?
If they do, they're not working for it. And that is part of what I'm attempting to do. So all this polling and all this, on paper, nonpartisans outnumber everyone else. So that means, and as a plurality state, that means you don't need a majority to win. You just need to get more votes than the other person.
Right.
If everyone voted their registration, a nonpartisan would win.
Wow.
And also what we've known for the last 15, 20 years is the rate of Democrats and Republicans that are cross-party voting, and it is increasing. So that's higher in Nevada Democrats than in Nevada Republicans. So basically, when I won, I registered as nonpartisan because personally I didn't see myself in either party. Now, choosing to run as a nonpartisan, that's a different thing, because I had to do this whole alternative process. I didn't have a primary, but I'll tell you, 400 people registered, filed for office, and 78% of them were taken out in the primaries.
Wow.
So these are people who said, I want to serve, and the parties took them out. And so with my race, I had to go directly to the people and do a petition.
Right.
But I appreciate that because I got to go through that process. There is a process. This is a harder road. Also, the other piece is by choosing to run as a nonpartisan, I have no machinery. The parties have machines, and what happens is basically, here's the Democrat slate, like you were talking about, circulating in certain communities. Here's who we're voting for, and in theory, everyone should line up behind the Democrat platform,
right,
and the Republican platform. We've seen over the last few years that those platforms are thin, and the loyalty or whatever is not present in the parties. So when I was in campaigning in 1998, the middle was big and valuable. Both parties were grabbing at the middle.
Right.
It's gotten even bigger where the parties are freaking out. And I shouldn't say they're freaking out. They are desperate for power. And that's just created more gridlock where nothing is happening. I mean, it's starting, I think one thing that bothers me is it's starting to become a kind of a joke that nothing happens in Congress. And the other part of that is a purity of understanding of the role of the citizen. This system is designed for people to participate. And when I lost my ability to vote, I was not people anymore. I was basically disconnected from community. And when that happens, here you are, justice involved, disconnected from community, you have no say. And so you have to swim upstream for that.
It's kind of like one of those things where you get something taken away from you that you didn't realize how valuable it was until it was taken away.
Absolutely.
Because there's so many people out there that have the right to vote and don't utilize it, have never utilized it. And I don't judge anybody because sometimes there's barriers to voting. Like you had a barrier that was taken away, but there are situations where people just simply don't care and they just don't want to vote. They just, oh, that doesn't have anything to do with me. I've heard they're not going to help our community anyways. Not just from my community. I've just heard that in general from people, from young people, especially these days. I've heard, oh, that doesn't really matter. So I've had to have conversations with my daughter and her friends, her now husband, and say that you guys do understand that voting is still important, right? Get your other friends to understand that. So as I'm advocating to you all need to go also do that to your friends, and then hopefully it circulates, right? And we've had this conversation recently, my daughter and I, and she said, I'm becoming, kind of like in the middle. And I said, nonpartisan. And she goes, yeah, that's what it is, which tells you she doesn't have a lot of education about the parties and then that there is a middle. And I said, so why? And she goes, Evan and I, and that's her husband. Evan is, obviously my daughter is black woman. Her husband is a white man. And they were Democratic. And they said recently they've been just watching how things are going with where they live, which is in California, but also just within the country and how nothing's being done about gun rights and gun laws and things of that nature. And this affects them. They're in their 20s. They want to have kids one day, right? They don't want their kids to have to be homeschooled because they can't go to school and be safe. So they think about these type of things and they're like, honestly, I don't feel like Democrats are doing enough. They're not, she literally said, they're not hype enough. And I said, that's interesting. And she goes, and then Republicans are just crazy. But it's the honesty, right?
Yeah.
It's the honesty that you can get from people of that age, that's how they look at both parties. And I said, okay, so the Democrats are not hyped. How would you like them to be hyped? Or what does hyped look like? And she's like, do something.
Yeah.
And just that alone, I was like, that's it. Do something. And I said, okay, so do you have any ideas on what they need to do? She goes, no, but I know as I'm sitting back watching the news, as I'm hearing about things happening, I just feel like the people that we checked the box for are not doing anything to stop the madmen. And I just think that conversation in general is just very enlightening because it comes from an innocent place. It comes from she has a master's degree and all that, so she's educated, but it comes from a non-educated place about the political system. But I think that's where we need to start. We need to start with people like that don't understand parties and all of those things, so that they're not also, we don't brainwash them into anything. We let them decide.
Today, I saw a story about Gen Z now can run for Congress, and there's a few candidates that are 25 years old. And when they talk about political events, it's very different, you know?
Yeah.
And civic education is something I had an amazing experience in high school, where deep dive into the Constitution, and that just really set this whole thing in motion where I always wanted to be part of the civic conversation. And that also connected with my healthcare background and public health. I don't think the government needs to be in the news every day. They need to be in the background taking care of us. And we, when things happen like pandemics and stuff, they kick in with their resources. They make decisions. They provide services. they take responsibility. And part of my inspiration is I don't want to be ashamed anymore of my past, because, I did some bad stuff, but I took ownership for it. And I took responsibility for it. And that's what I'm inviting Nevadans to do, is and just like your daughter and other people in that age group, it's like, you do have the power.
Right.
The numbers are there. And if there was a consequential election where someone other than the party won, I would hope that would inspire your daughter to go, oh yeah, I can think differently, because the parties are they're branded.
Right.
There was some very interesting book I read that really analyzed the parties as corporate competitors, and it was fascinating. It accounted for so much behavior that this commodity.
Animal Farm, was it?
No, but that's a good one.
That's a good book.
All pigs are created equal. Some pigs are more equal than others. But that's a perfect classic metaphor one. Yeah. But that's the conversation is, and that's why it's so interesting to talk to you about what the work you do, because of a lack of cultural humility, because of prescriptive government, basically, there was no help and people died because of it.
Right.
And also, we know general stuff about Black men, for example. 1 in 3 Black men have a criminal record, and they're high risk for everything cardiovascular.
And 1 in 8 Black people have HIV.
And HIV and prostate cancer. I mean, well, not the women, I guess. But,
not.
So there's this, and where do the conversations happen? In the barbershops. There's cultural competency and awareness for that. And that it's more important that people get access to the information, access to services, and then they have a choice.
Right.
Without even access, there is no choice.
Right.
And that's something that in healthcare specifically, and the work that you and I have done with community health workers, we've done some real deep dives into working with families and tough decisions. And really, it comes down to, do you understand the consequences of this decision?
Right.
It is your choice. And I think that translates into political activity. Do you understand the consequences of not participating?
And people always like to leave those as two separate things. Oh, don't, because of the separation between church and state, everybody's like, don't bring up politics in the work, area if you work for an organization or a company, or we can't talk about politics here, but we have to. We have to learn how, and it's not politics per se that we need to talk about, it's choices, it's access. And are we going to give people access, or are we not? And then what does that do if we don't, And so it's one of those conversations where you kind of have to have it, whether you're saying you're having it or not. Maybe it's just a general conversation about, we asked a organization. So I'm also a co-host of the Urban Chamber of Commerce Healthcare Roundtable. So every month we find healthcare professionals in different areas and in different leadership positions to come on. And sometimes they're in outreach positions or things of that nature. But we just have them come on, tell us what their company does, what they do for that company. And then we had recently someone on from a healthcare company. We asked, how do you all get involved in the political process? And you wouldn't think that question would have come out. But because Urban Chamber is all about small businesses, it all interconnects. If I'm a small business owner, which I am, you're a healthcare company, you are my potential stakeholder that I want to go after, right? To get business from. But also now you connect to the community, but you're not talking to legislators. Most likely you all have lobbyists that are fighting for something that you want. So why isn't that conversation coming up in business? And then how does that affect your clients or your patients? Because it is, because whatever you're lobbying for is going to ultimately affect your patients. And so I like to always say that there's always an intersectionality of everything. Mm-hmm. Small business, no matter what you do in business, no matter what job you work in, politics, being involved in advocacy for other people, yourself, your family, it all goes together. And once we, I think, just kind of take this kind of, separation out of our brains and say, oh, I can only talk about this over here. I can only talk about this over here, and start talking about no, because this affects this and this affects this. I think that's when and I think that next generation, like my daughter's age, they're going to be the ones to do that. I think we're too old and set in our ways at this point. A lot of people are.
Yeah. Well, in community, there's layers, right? And part of cultural humility is not just color, ethnicity, language, it's age. There's old Black people, there's old white people, and there's different needs in that. I think the biggest issue with distinguishing politics and talking about it is, at the end of the day, the elected officials are supposed to govern.
Right.
And government is supposed to serve all the people. Once you win, if I win lieutenant governor, I will serve all the people, and I will uphold the law. And I'm excited about going middle out, because that mandate that the people say, we want someone who will focus on us.
Right.
And not the party agendas. I'm excited about that, and I hope that it excites other people.
Yeah.
But that's the main difference that I've seen between last time I was super active in a campaign.
Right.
Is that at the end of the day, whoever won the election was responsible for governing, and they worked on the other side because they all understood the consequences of bad government. That's not happening anymore.
Right. And the funny thing about that is, remember, I took you to one of the election campaign things that people were doing in North Las Vegas.
Yes.
And it was like about 5 candidates, and it was in the community, so people got to get up and talk. And you actually told me that one of the older Black ladies got up at the end and was on the microphone. And what did she end up telling you? Or not you, but the audience.
And so what I took away from that as an observer of politics was that was the most revealing word spoken during that whole event, because it was mayor candidates talking to Black people, the Black Caucus, ACLU, but this lady gets up, older Black lady, she said, I've been a Democrat for 38 years, and I can't with the party, why should I vote for any of you?
Yeah.
And they were gobsmacked.
Frozen.
They didn't know what to say.
They were frozen.
And that's so telling that, like we had just talked about, the history, you inherit the history of Democrats.
Right.
And one little trivia point. One of the main reasons to correct or restore civil rights to people with criminal records was Florida and Gore v. Bush. Mm-hmm. There were about 60,000, I think, disenfranchised felons who couldn't vote. And the belief was that if they could, they would have voted for Gore, and that would have been a whole different world.
Right.
So, interesting little tidbit there. And not all states are like that. Some states, I know the state, Maine, actually, you never lose the right to vote. They poll in prisons. I think that's a brilliant idea.
I think that's brilliant.
So it's, I think that's what I'm most excited about, is synthesizing these different experiences: community health work, healthcare, politics, but then government.
Right.
Because that's the part that touches the organizations and the people, is government. And when it's not working, then it's up to all of us to fix it.
And I can definitely say, you said something in the very beginning about how there's more people that are nonpartisan on paper. I recently just found out that a couple of my friends are. Of course, we don't, what did you vote and how do you vote? And we don't really go into those things unless it's dealing with business and things of that nature. But I was very surprised to see so many people that were like, I'm nonpartisan. And I don't know how it even came out. I don't know what the conversation was about, but I literally dropped my jaw and I was like, I did not know that. How long? And it's kind of like one of those, how long have you been clean? Yeah. And it was just like, I said, wow, you're Black, you're nonpartisan, and nobody knows that. And I said, that's interesting, because I work in HIV as well, right? And so to me, it's like one of those stigmatized things that you can't really talk about. I'm not going to share with you, that only the doctors know on paper, right? And it's kind of one of those things. And I was like, why don't you tell people that? And they're just like, it's none of their business. Mm-hmm. But really, there's a fear behind it, is what I think. I think there's a fear of not being accepted into certain communities, because certain communities do expect you to vote their way, the majority of the way, right? And so I just found that very interesting. And I said, well, how do you like voting that way? Do you feel like you're pretty neutral? And a couple of them told me, well, I actually feel like I'm kind of put into a box, even more so because I don't get to vote for all the candidates. And that's kind of where we left off with that. And I just said, and I've just been thinking about that ever since, like, this is such a weird thing that we have to check boxes to say who we are and that we're not allowed to change. or that we're now put into this other box and now we don't get to see all of the candidates. So it's, it's just one of those things that's kind of interesting to me. I just wanted to know from a small business standpoint, how does politics and nonpartisanship and you getting the role of lieutenant governor possibly, how would that play into my small business?
The lieutenant governor is a really interesting position in state government. It's the only elected official that works both in the executive branch and the legislative branch. So on the executive branch side, the lieutenant governor is chair of the Commission on Tourism. And so that is a state agency that does it collects a lot of data, but it also is the one that runs, publicly funded campaigns to promote tourism. Las Vegas has had the best few months ever in the history of ever.
We have.
And I think Las Vegas it's on its own. It's profit driven,
Yes.
so they're doing fine. But tourism, one of my first jobs working at Lake Mead Cruises out of Boulder City.
Yeah.
That's based on tourism and hospitality. I worked in restaurants and stuff like that. Those are small businesses. It was small businesses that gave me a job when no one else would. My first job after I got my master's was washing dishes at a Mediterranean restaurant. A week after I got my master's, and I was happy to have a job.
Wow.
And it was kind of funny because I went to that interview like in a collared shirt with a copy of my resume. That was a real awareness moment for me, because it was like, can you show up tomorrow? I'm like, sure. So one part of that is all those operators that are impacted by tourism. The Commission on Tourism and sharing that provides some direction and a voice for those small operators who are directly connected to the hospitality and tourism industry. The other major role, the most visible role of the lieutenant governor is the legislative role, which is president of the Senate.
Okay.
And so basically it's the same as the speaker on the assembly. So the speaker is always the leader of the majority party.
Okay.
But with the Senate, the lieutenant governor is the president of the Senate. And it could be, it's always been a partisan. If I'm elected, I would be the first nonpartisan lieutenant governor and the first nonpartisan president of the Senate.
I can see how that's a big deal.
So I don't know how to communicate this, or this is one of the things that makes it so interesting, because we have the legislation has to pass both houses. That's the bicameral requirement, right? So every bill has to go through both the Senate and the Assembly. The Senate, in every places like that, Congress, there's only one state that has a unicameral legislature. So I see that being very important, because I'm a small business owner.
Yeah.
And the challenges of administration, and you're a small business owner, and how much time every week do we spend on admin,
Oh gosh.
accounting, doing our
Yes.
stuff, who's doing our taxes, and
Right.
payroll, all that stuff. And also as far as taxation on small businesses, because I imagine you're in the same boat as I. We don't pay the modified business tax because we don't have revenue that's big enough like that, and we have very few employees, so we don't pay those taxes. But it's something, there's more small businesses, and so many people work for small businesses, period. So they need to have representation, but they may not be able to afford a membership in the Las Vegas Chamber, which represents business. And there's some initiatives as far as supporting small businesses that the Lieutenant Governor's office can do. And that's what I would continue to do, is to continue the work of supporting small businesses through economic development, because the Lieutenant Governor also serves on the Economic Development Board, not as a member, not as a chair or anything like that. So
I think that's really important to know. Most of my friends are small business owners, whether they work a full-time job and have a small business on the side, or whether they work their small business full-time. And so if I'm around that all the time, then of course that's part of our conversations. But I don't think, again, going back to that, the separation, we're not thinking about representation from whatever party and how that's going to look for our small business. We're just thinking individually, but we have to also consider that our businesses may be will be affected by whomever gets in, right? Because their ideals and their views on business will come into play. And whether that's passing new bills that's going to help businesses or is going to tax more businesses, we need to know that.
Well, and I think one you were talking about your massage therapist who's licensed by the state.
Right.
25% of all work has to be licensed by a state. And there are 13,000 laws on the state books collectively that bar people with criminal records from getting occupational and professional licenses.
Wow.
So, for example, in Louisiana, there's a great program where in the women's prison, they trained to be cosmetologists, and they had to do a bunch of law changes in order to provide legal training to do the testing, so that when women are discharged from prison, that they have a license and they can go instantly do a job
And use that license.
Absolutely. And so our common friends who are barbers, same thing. So if there's occupational licensing, that's impacting these small businesses.
Right.
You can. One of the great things about America and Nevada is you can throw up your shingle and cut hair.
Yeah.
And that was some of the great work that Tyrone Thompson did with Ban the Box. Ban the Box, he started in North Las Vegas, and then he got the bill passed in 2017. Okay, I want to make sure that's the right year. I think that's the right year, 2017. One Republican supported that bill.
Right.
Governor Brian Sandoval, when he signed it into law. But he didn't just sign it into law. He sent his state head of personnel, and they argued Governor Sandoval believes the state is missing out on talent because of the question of that, have you ever had any sort of record?
Right.
So I think that's another part. If licensed professionals like barbers and cosmetologists, and Nevada's got dozens of little boards, even psychotherapists and marriage and family counselors, they all have a license. And if we have this hardcore, you can't have a criminal record, we are losing a lot of talent. And if you can't work, what are you going to do to make money?
And you and I talked about that with CHWs. Do we license CHWs or do we not?
Right.
Because that could potentially harm the field in general from a national standpoint, but also from a state level. If they have to have licenses, if we're really utilizing people from the actual communities, putting a license standard on them might actually take away a lot of talent.
It could, but it also, there's a balancing act to that. For 6 years, I ran the Osteopathic Medical Board, and I took it from a spreadsheet to the first online license renewal of any license in the state. And that was a lot of heavy lifting. But I learned two major things. These are doctors, these are physicians, and the board is made up of physicians, so they understand the practice, and it's peer regulation, so we keep track of each other. But the other side of that is the main purpose of licensing is to protect the public.
Right.
And in medicine, you certainly want competent doctors. Right.
Right.
And in community health work, when we talk about that, it's definitely I want to continue my doctor thing. With a doctor license, you're licensed, Dr. Howard, but that license is worth millions of dollars over your career.
Right.
And it's all your staff that don't have jobs if you can't work.
Very true.
And so while it was a privilege, it turned into a property right, and to protect the public, you have an impact over licensing. So the question, whenever we consider licensing somebody, is there's a cost, and then to the person, and that anytime there's a cost to get into something, there's a barrier to people becoming community health workers or whatever. And then also, is the agency capable of protecting the public? How do they respond? Because you kind of want to hammer at some point.
Right.
And I think a deeper conversation can happen with where community health workers fall into the super regulated chain of healthcare.
Right.
But these are small businesses, because to have a effective community health worker agency, it would need to really, live in the community. And if it's too big for that community.
Right.
So on some level, there is that. It does legitimize the profession by protecting, by ensuring certain levels of education and et cetera. But I will say this, like in medicine, one of the physicians I worked with, he said, practicing medicine is 60% art, 40% science, which is so interesting because you can only test on 40% of the science. So, and that's community health work. Community health work is art. It really complementary.
It's magic.
So then when you establish a licensing standard, how do you measure that in an objective way where we can train to it or et cetera? So that's a lot to talk about with small businesses, but when we think about the role of government in small business, regulating, it's one thing, okay, you and I are small business owners, we don't have to pay the modified business tax, but if we are employing people that need credentials, we really need to be accountable for that and make sure they have the credentials for our protection too.
Absolutely.
Liability is a big issue too. So anyway, small businesses are they're one of the largest employers of people, period. 2, they're critical for certain jobs.
Right.
And also they have, like in my situation, it was small businesses that would actually hire me because the owner would talk to me and they were willing to give me a job when
And
no one else
small
would.
businesses saved us during the Depression.
Absolutely.
So
Well, thank you so much for hanging out. I
thank
so
you for having me.
appreciate it.
I appreciate you.
Cool beans.